Welcome to the end of chapter 23, the beginning of chapter 24, and then a variations in population lab that we're going to do at the end. We've been talking about natural selection and how different forces, including natural selection, can lead to a change in gene frequency or allele frequency in a population from one generation to the next. And that's evolution, all right? So we talk about populations changing over time. How do they change in a meaningful, kind of consistent, stable way? Well, it's through the changes in the genes you see in the population. Changes in the gene pool, frequencies of genes that you find in the gene pool. That's what we're focused on. So, with chapter 24, we're going to be looking at natural selection in a little bit more detail. And then that's chapter 23. And then when we move to chapter 24 here in a few minutes, we're going to be looking at kind of environmental and biological factors that can begin causing a separation into populations and a branching out into different forms. And we'll eventually talk about what we call speciation, which is how you get whole new kind of types of living things. Now, one topic on the in this realm of natural selection that I want us to focus on first is fitness. Fitness, or relative fitness, if you want to be a little bit more specific about it. And I like the point the book makes. I think too often, and this is the point your book makes, too often you have this idea of like survival of the strongest. The biggest and strongest survive. Yeah, I mean, you could look at like the age of the dinosaurs. Things got very big and strong and violent. But that's also why the dinosaurs died out. They were a little too big when their population changed very dramatically, very quickly. And it was actually the mammals that rose out of that destruction, and we survived because we were tiny and furry. Fitness is kind of a better way to look at the concept of your ability to survive and reproduce. And that's really what fitness is a measure of. Fitness is basically just the idea that you are going to leave more genes, more of your genes in the next generation than others. That makes an individual fit. How that happens can vary. You do not have to be big and strong. You can be small. You can be camouflaged. You can be smart. As humans, we have a pretty successful track record so far in being able to spread throughout the world into different environments, survive and reproduce, and show a high level of fitness. And I'm going to tell you, as a primate of your size, you are incredibly frail and weak. You go up against a gorilla, or say one of our closest relatives, a chimpanzee. A female chimpanzee would crush you in a fight if it wanted to, because humans are not very robust, physically speaking. Our fitness comes mainly from our intelligence, our social abilities to communicate and work together. So this is what I want you to kind of focus your mind on. Not terms like survival of the fittest, or even this idea of struggling for existence. A struggle for existence is part of the evolutionary game, but it really comes down to how fit you are for the environment at this time. Now, with that in mind, I want to look at the three kind of subtypes of natural selection. So you don't always have a push in one direction specifically. That is one of the subtypes, directional selection, but there are other ways in which nature can kind of select for certain individuals. And there are different results that you get from these different subgroups of natural selection. So again, we have directional, disruptive, and stabilizing. So we're going to talk about each one briefly, and the next slide is really, to me, kind of the easiest way to visualize this because it's got charts of all three types. So these same terms are going to be written on each graph on this slide. So here we have the three different ones: directional, disruptive, and stabilizing selection. So you have to kind of start with a baseline. We're going to call that the original population up here. And in this case, we're looking at mice. And this is another good example of kind of thinking about fitness as opposed to strong or big. Here we have mice of different fur colors, from very light to a darker fur color and some in between. Now, if you have directional selection, you find that the population is being pushed to one side or the other, to one extreme or the other. And in the case of this example, here was our original population in black, which shows a full range of diversity. And over time, for one reason or another, nature selects for either the darker or the lighter colors. Now, this could happen for size. Smaller or bigger could be better or worse in terms of being fit for your environment. So if you see a selection towards one end of this range of possibilities or the other, we call that directional selection. This has happened to both birds and horses over the last 50 or 60 million years. Horses at the beginning of our current geological era were like the size of cats, and they had little toes. Over the last 50 million years or so, they have been selected for larger and larger sizes, and now horses are much bigger than they once were. Birds actually went somewhat in the other direction. 50, 60 million years ago, we had these like 8 to 10 foot tall terror birds that roamed different parts of the world. Enormous predatory birds that actually ate these small horses I just mentioned. And birds have definitely seen a push towards a smaller and smaller size. And there are a lot of environmental reasons for that. What's the problem with being a big bird?
Hard to fly.
Flight is kind of have to give up flight, you know. That's a tendency for, especially when you get to be 400 or 500 pounds and 8 to 10 feet tall.
You have to eat a lot.
You have to eat a lot. That's a big problem for all large animals. Access to food. The bigger you are, the more you have to eat. And as soon as you run into an environment where the food is scarce, the big ones die first. Where do big birds lay their eggs?
Nests.
In nests that are located
Oh, no.
right on the ground, where all sorts of different rodents and insects like ants can easily access the eggs and kill them off. So it's not great to be a big bird in today's world. All right, then we have kind of a weird one. This is a selection type that you don't see near as often, and it's hard to give good, like, simple examples. Disruptive selection is really when kind of the mid-range size or mid-range phenotype, it doesn't have to be size, gets selected against. And in this example, you could probably picture an environment where it's good to be either very dark or very light in color, but not in between. Some fish populations, you see this happen where you can be the biggest and not be eaten, or the smallest and be very good at hiding and thriving in shallow waters where bigger things can't even get to you. But in between, you can't outcompete the big ones and you can't hide as well as the small ones. So this disruptive selection is a little bit different, not as common, but you can have kind of the average of whatever the phenotype is be selected against. And finally, you have what's called stabilizing selection, the opposite of disruptive selection, where it is that mid-ground that is the best. In this example, kind of your mid-ranged color of fur in this example is the one that's selected for. It really tightens the kind of normal bell-shaped distribution into a much tighter range. I guess in a lot of ways you're losing a good deal of variation. You see this in, say, human baby birth weights. There's a very strong selection against giant 20-pound babies being born and against, very tiny underweight babies. So we have found, like with human birth weight, that trait seems to be tightened around, say, 6 to 8 pounds and not stray outside of it very often. So those are the different types of selection that you can have in terms of natural selection. And here I give a little bit more background information, but I really encourage you to keep up with your reading, and you can use these slides and some of the text on them later just to kind of review. So I want to go on and talk about something that's not natural selection, but what we call sexual selection. And this is something that really bothered Darwin at first. I think Darwin was so focused on, nature shapes populations. Populations change because of the environment they're in. But it's not all the environment you're in. A lot of selection that you see in different populations actually comes from the individuals in the population making choices about who they're going to have babies with. And that's what we call sexual selection. This is basically when mates select for certain traits.
Oh, if there's a big.
Well, we're going to talk about one classic example that you're probably familiar with, but you may not have realized it was sexual selection. Your book goes into some more detail. There are actually intra and intersexual selection events where competing males will kind of push against other males with other phenotypes and try to run them out of the mating game. And then what we probably are most familiar with is usually like female choice in mates, which is what we see in the peacock, which is going to, and peahen, which is what I'm going to show you as an example in just a second. But if pronounced enough, you will start to see what we call sexual dimorphism, which is a term I really want. I know there's a lot of terms and I want you to be familiar with as many as you can. But this is a term that I think in the world of biology is a pretty commonly used term. Sexual dimorphism literally just means that males and females show up as two different kind of appearances. And you can see this. I mean, I could take you out to the chicken coop on campus, and you could pretty easily pick out amongst the adults which ones are the roosters and which ones are the hens. Even from simple things like, are they crowing and being obnoxious, which means male, or are they peaceful and quiet and gentle like the female hens I have out there? But here is the classic example of sexual selection. So these are peafowl. These are pea birds. This is a peahen, because it is the female. The male is the peacock. So we don't really use those terms quite accurately enough in everyday life. But look at this tail. These are the tail feathers of the peacock, the male peafowl. The peacock tail is ridiculous. It is very long, it's ornate, and I'm going to tell you right now, the environment is not very happy with this tail. All right? This tail for this bird in a day-to-day surviving in the environment is a drag. All this tail is going to do is allow a predator to grab you by the tail and kill you. That's not going to help you survive. But the problem is this. The peahen is so picky about mating and courtship that if even one of these circles is off, it could make the difference between her choosing this male or not. And they've done studies where they take like some tape and just tape over like one of these. I mean, look how many there are. They just put tape over one of them and they see a significant drop in how often a female will choose to mate with this male. Just because one of these little dots is covered up. So what's happened is, because the females are selecting for this tail, it has become elaborate, even though nature does not seem, nature as in the non-living kind of environment, does not necessarily favor it. It also means you have to eat a lot more in order to have the energy and nutrients to grow such a tail. But he still got it, even though it could get him killed. That's sexual selection. So, we're going to move on, and I'm going to just try to give you a basis for your reading for tonight into next class, which is the beginning of chapter 24. Chapter 24 is about kind of larger scale, what we would call macroevolutionary events, macroevolution. Chapter 23 is focused on basically how you can see small changes from one generation to the next. What we're going to look at in chapter 24 is when you extend the time frame and start looking at many, many generations, how can you actually get one group to become split off from each other and so different that they become two distinct groups known as species? So there's a lot of discussion of this word species in chapter 24. There are also a lot of definitions for the word species. For a variety of reasons, it is pretty difficult to nail down one, no pun intended here, one specific definition for species, which comes from the word specific. Typically, we have a definition for species in which you have two groups. Like if they're two different species, those two groups cannot interbreed successfully. They cannot meet have children and have those children either be born or survive or they themselves reproduce. So there's a lot of definitions or a lot of components to the definition biological species concept where they can interbreed, their offspring have to be able to live and produce offspring, and then those offspring need to be able to continue that ability to reproduce. And there are examples like the mule. The mule is the result of what two species interbreeding?
Donkey and horse.
Donkey and horse. The problem a mule has is that its chromosomal numbers, I believe that's the problem with the mule, are a little bit off because of the donkey and the horse chromosome numbers, and the mule itself cannot go on to have children. So there you have a case of two groups that can interbreed, have a baby, but that baby cannot continue having more offspring and continuing generations. Now, if I say just two species, in your head, you probably pretty easily think about like, oh, two very different groups. Like any bird or any snake would be different species. It's very easy to see how they are their own specific thing. But it does get a little harder when you look at, say, two different species of bird or two different species of squirrel. Sometimes they're quite similar, and you might wonder what's that line that divides them. This definition is one definition for what a species is. So just kind of keep that in your head. So what chapter 24 is looking at, and we're going to kind of zip through a number of different things and wrap up here in a second, but everything chapter 24 is dedicated to is looking at how multiple populations of the same species can, over time, branch off from one another. What are the events and forces that could cause a population that is capable of interbreeding and is basically the same species? What could cause it to take its own path and eventually become so different that they don't look the same, or at the very least, they cannot interbreed with one another? And there's probably a lot of different things you didn't think about or don't even realize exist, and a lot of them are all laid out on the next slide. So everything we're about to talk about, and I'm not going to go into much detail on each one of them, and your reading for tonight looks at what can cause this branching out. There's a lot on this slide. But in general, these are all the possible barriers that could exist that would effectively separate two populations. Once you've separated two populations, natural and sexual selection can very easily carry them in very different directions. But you kind of have to have these barriers first before a group will just take its own evolutionary path and change over time in a way that's different from a group it used to be a part of. Now, everything you see up here is broken into what we call pre- and post-zygotic. Zygotic refers to a zygote, which is a fertilized egg, which is that first stage for, say, us, the first moment at which you become a diploid cell and then start through mitosis heading towards adulthood, one division at a time. Pre-zygotic barriers mean what are things that can prevent fertilization from even happening. So why is it that a sperm cell could just not get to the egg cell of individuals from these two groups? Now, habitat can play a role. And again, your book goes through all of these, and I would strongly recommend that you read about each one of these. If two organisms or two groups of organisms, two populations, if they find themselves, even if they're in the same region, just spending their time in different kind of niches, different parts of the environment, they may never really meet. They may effectively separate each other. They give the example of these flies that are kind of two groups of fly that could interbreed, but one group spends all their time on one type of plant and another group spends all its time on another type of plant, and so they never meet to mate. Temporal isolation. Temporal means what? What four-letter T word? Temporary. Not temperature. That's good. Thank you for guessing. Temporary is related to the idea of temporal.
Oh.
Time. When you see temporal, it means time. It can be a kind of timing-based separation. Some organisms just will mate during the day only or mate during the night only. That is something that can just prevent two populations. Or not just during the day, but seasons. Mating seasons can be just a week different. And you can start seeing two populations take their own path because they never interbreed because of the timing of their mating seasons or the time they're just awake and living. Behavioral isolation, a lot of times these are mating behaviors in which, this is something in birds you see. Song calls can change by, a few notes, and that can make a difference in kind of sexual selection and attracting a mate. And then these two are actually, notice they have this term mating attempt, so these kind of prevent even meeting to mate. Mechanical and gametic isolation, these are barriers that actually can happen after a mating attempt. They talk about these snails who have different shaped genitals so they don't actually even fit together for sexual reproduction. And sometimes it's the sperm and egg cells that can't chemically communicate. You could have two populations that are very similar, but if a slight change in cell receptors on the sperm cells of one population get changed, the sperm cells may not even be able to find the egg cell after mating has occurred. So there are barriers to the actual, kind of fertilization event. And then post-zygotic barriers are kind of weird. These are cases, and this has the horse, donkey, and mule example. These are cases where fertilization happens. Now, what we have found is that, and a lot of times this is kind of a chromosomal number issue, or it's just the genes that pair together after fertilization. You can have these situations where the offspring, the baby that is produced from fertilization, doesn't develop properly. Maybe you can't even have a successful pregnancy as a result of mating. You can have situations where the baby is born, but the babies they have, like in the case of the mule, they're not capable of reproducing. They have fertility or sterility issues. And then finally, you can have a situation, and they see this in plants a lot. Plants have some really bizarre mating situations that arise. You can have a situation where maybe even for a few generations, you can have successful offspring, but there's a breakdown from one generation to the next for a variety of genetic reasons. So it's not just that two populations are separated, like they just end up on different islands or something and they develop or evolve separately. You can have situations where they are living together and sometimes what seem like minor details can just basically isolate or break apart a population because they cannot exchange genetic information. Chapter 24 then moves on to this idea of speciation, which is basically the creation of new species, where two populations that were once the same not only become isolated in some way, but they have remained isolated so long, so many changes have accumulated in these isolated populations that they become distinctly different and become their own species. And your book goes into a lot of detail here. I encourage you to delve into it as much as you can. We have what's called allopatric and sympatric speciation. And I have one last slide here that just shows the general difference. This is a very simplified, stylized kind of depiction that we have here. But we see cases all the time of a population that is together and interbreeding. And with allopatric speciation, a lot of times it can be like a geographical barrier that physically separates the two populations, and given enough time, they each separately change into their own species. But you can have this happen even without populations being separated. And if you think about that last slide, all of those are examples where you can have members of in the same region attempt mating, but it just in the long run does not work out to a continuous generational line. I think with this unit, it's less abstract and weird than a lot of the units we've talked about in the past, but there are a lot of concepts and terminology that are used, so please don't fall behind on that. We're going to do a little activity and collect some data on populations of bean babies, and we're going to collect that data. I will post that data online once we collect it, and that's what we're going to do for the last part of this class. So you can stop the video.